Hello, everyone. Welcome to this Academica University of Applied Sciences webinar on evidence-informed educational leadership, how learning science provides a sustainable model for lasting improvement in instructional practice. I'm Dr. Jim Heal, Professor of Evidence-Informed Education Leadership at Academica University of Applied Sciences. And today I'm going to be talking to you about the relationship between leadership and learning. And what is it about learning that leaders ought to know and be able to understand and apply? And how can an understanding of learning and of the mind inform the way that leaders make their decisions? In order to do that, I was going to give you a little bit of background on myself and to give you a sense of some of the work that I have been leading over the last few years. And in so doing, to give you a sense of what have I been learning as I've been moving along this continuum of working in the field. So to begin with, I spent time working at Deans for Impact, which was a non-profit, a national non-profit here in the United States, working to infuse learning science principles into teacher preparation. In other words, the colleges of education that prepare our teachers in the first place. And the scale of that was quite significant. Over the course of the 10 years that the organization was going and the first 6 years of my time there, we ended up working with over 260 colleges of education. So certainly this idea of impact occurring at scale and what it takes to make that happen. Then in my work, some of the work that I currently do within districts here in the United States, I've been lucky enough to work across 14 different districts over the last couple of years through my organization, Learning Science Partners. That's over 800 schools. That's nearly 40,000 educators, and that's over 500,000 students. And then, of course, there's the work of Academica itself, the idea that in any given year, Academica prepares over 2,000 future leaders within the education space and more broadly. And there are 65 educational programs that support that work. And so I offer this to you because it's important to understand that this isn't so much about what leadership looks like in a given classroom on a given day, which of course that matters, but also what does that impact look like as you start to zoom out and look at it from the perspective of a leader in particular. And I want to start with a kind of a metaphor here to describe, what I often see as part of the dysfunction at play. So I tend to think of this, and this comes from the work that I've done alongside my colleague at Learning Science Partners, Meg Lee, the idea of the initiative carousel. And perhaps many of you who work in educational systems have some notion of what this feels like, which is that school systems tend to introduce new initiatives and that once people get used to understanding how it might be playing out within their context, the carousel of initiatives just keeps on spinning and keeps on spinning. And what ends up happening within a system is that the initiatives come and go so quickly that everyone within the system is just desperately trying to hold on. And more often than not, that doesn't necessarily work, and people can get flung out of the system and are no longer able to give the best of themselves in support of the aims of that system. So I want to talk about how to change that and what does it look like to grow a sense of what it means to understand learning and to grow competency around how to apply that understanding within instructional contexts, but critically to be able to do that at scale without simply it happening in small pockets or small bright spots, or even worse, that improvement is kind of being left to chance and we're sort of letting the cards fall where they may. So to begin with, I'm going to talk about actually what does improvement look like? What do we know from the science of learning that tells us about the different ways in which we might become better at something? What does the science tell us about the different types of expertise that we grow over time? And there's at least a few ways of thinking about this. The first is the idea that when we become more expert, we hold information more durably. We have, over time, been able to build networks of interconnected ideas that, because we have gotten used to retrieving those ideas and understanding how they fit into other aspects of our understanding of the world, our appreciation of those concepts and our memory of those concepts is durable. There is a degree of retention of those ideas such that we can return to them and use them when we need them. Another way of thinking about expertise is the question of speed or fluency. As someone becomes more expert, it is not just that they know more, it is not just that they know more about the relationships between ideas, but they move closer to what we call kind of either fluency or automaticity. Subtly different things, but the ability to be able to do things more quickly, more efficiently, and indeed to do things in ways that reduce unnecessary cognitive load. Then there's this question of effort. This again does tie with, but is subtly different to fluency. And that is to say, the more expert you become at something, the less effort it appears that you are putting into it. We often think of this with sports people or artists or dancers, that there might be something about it that appears effortless. The irony being, of course, that level of automaticity comes about as a result of an enormous amount of effort and the difficulty that comes with developing. Then we have this idea of structure. As I mentioned earlier, we don't, as we become more expert at things at least, learn things in isolation or as a series of singularities. We actually start to build structured networks of ideas. And as we know, those structures of ideas are referred to as schema. And another way of thinking about somebody's improving expertise is simply to say that their schema, or the manner in which they structure the knowledge that they have, becomes more nuanced, becomes more sophisticated, and of course becomes more expansive. What does this allow us to do? Well, as our schema improves and becomes more nuanced and far-reaching, we begin to be able to engage in discrimination between different types of ideas. You get to acknowledge the patterns within a span of ideas, and you can look for the signal within the noise, let's say. A good example of this might be a radiologist or an X-ray technician who can look at a scan, and what appears to us to be just a series of blotches or shadows ends up being something within which the expert eye can spot the patterns that tell us what is going on beneath the surface. And then finally, at least in terms of this list, there's this degree of self-awareness that becomes more and more prominent. Metacognition is a part of this, but the argument here also is that it goes beyond to the level of your self-perception of knowledge. I'm sure that many of us have heard before of the Dunning-Kruger effect, namely that the more novice you are in something, the more likely you are to overestimate your abilities in that domain. But as you become more expert, your awareness around what you do know and what you don't, and what is knowable and what is not, becomes again more refined over time. So these are all the many ways in which one might be able to become more expert in something. But none of these things necessarily, apart from potentially the durability piece, speak to this notion of the nature of the knowledge itself. What are there different types of knowledge, some of which are more useful to us than others? And to here, I'm going to turn to the work of Daniel Willingham, who's written really thoughtfully about what he calls the difference between brittle knowledge and flexible knowledge. And this is part of what I consider to be really key when it comes to the role of leaders within educational contexts in particular. So when describing brittle knowledge, we think of this more as this notion of, well, if my knowledge is brittle, I can repeat it back to you. The question I'm essentially asking myself is, what are the steps that I need to perform in order to achieve what it is I'm trying to achieve? And I can do it when I'm told. I can do it at the level of, let's say, compliance or following instructions or directions. Flexible knowledge, by comparison, requires you to have much more internalized agency, if you will, within the idea, that you own it in some way, that you can wield it rather than just simply following orders. So in this instance, flexible knowledge you can express in your own way without losing the essence of the idea at the center. instead of asking what steps should I do, you get to say what kind of problem am I trying to solve for in the first place. And perhaps most critically of all, you know when and within which sets of conditions to do it. So this idea of knowing something at a brittle level is not sufficient in being able to lead instruction or any other aspect of your life. An example might be driving a car. It would be one thing to learn to drive a car within these kinds of conditions. And if you grew up in a town like this, a small town American town, then you would be forgiven for thinking that you, quote, know how to drive a car. But what if you moved somewhere like this? What if the conditions within which that same activity are sufficiently different that you need to rely on a flexible understanding of what it means to drive a car in order to be able to shift across those changing conditions? And the important point here, of course, being that we're talking about the same basic rules of the road, the same spatial reasoning and awareness that you need to be a good driver. It is simply the environment that changes. And when those environments change, it asks of us this question of, are we flexible enough to be able to move with those changing conditions? And is our knowledge flexible enough to be able to be applied across a range of different conditions? And so when we move from brittle to flexible, we see ourselves engaging in a number of shifts. You know, we move from only being able to see things in specific terms to having a more generalized view that says, I don't just see the parts, I can see how the parts fit together. Then we have this notion of whether or not you're context bound or context flexible. As you move from being brittle to more flexible in your understanding, you can start to appreciate how certain domains and concepts within them can kind of bleed across different lines of division and different sort of arenas within which that work is happening. Think again the difference between driving in a small town versus driving in a major city. And then, of course, this notion of compliance versus, let's say, application at the level of your own nuanced understanding. Knowing when to do something and under what environmental conditions to do so and what calls upon you to do so is such an important skill, be that a teacher or a leader within an educational context. But of course, there is a problem, which is to say that educational systems tend to not just rely upon, but actually reinforce the tendency to use brittle over flexible knowledge. The manner in which we organize systems, which is often quite top-down, quite compliance-driven, and in which in the spirit or in the striving for alignment and coherence, the expectation is that we kind of follow in lockstep the given curriculum or instructional processes and practices that are sort of idiosyncratic to your own environment. But what that unwittingly does is invite this kind of brittle, stuck in one time and place thinking of knowledge. So let me give you an example of what that might look like. You know, it would be one thing to start every class with an act of retrieval because you have been told to by your district. That is a far cry from understanding how memory works and therefore knowing how best to utilize retrieval as a result of that understanding. This plays out across all layers of the system, right? You could imagine, as I just mentioned, the teacher who can describe it but doesn't know how to use it effectively. This could be a school leader who understands a principle like cognitive load theory, but violates it on a weekly basis in the way that they communicate with their staff. The number of times even when I was a leader in schools, where I would theoretically adhere to the notion of cognitive load theory, but then on a Monday morning send out an email to all staff with 17 things to think about and prioritize over the course of the next 5 days. And then, of course, even at the district and regional level, executive leaders are ones who get to say, well, we're guided by evidence and we buy curriculum off the shelf that says it is evidence-based. Oh, and by the way, we've long supported learning styles and our plan is to continue to do so. These kinds of decisions set the tone and put the train on the track for where that given region or district is going to head. And if you are investing time, money, and human resources in aspects of learning that we now know do not work, then as a leader, there is a high likelihood that you're not going to see any change based on the kinds of inputs and resource allocation in which you may or may not engage. And so there's a very important takeaway that I want to drive home for you today, which is that if the basis upon which we consider ideas of learning are based on principles of the mind, okay, and those principles are in and of themselves flexible, then it must be the case that the principles precede the practice. It is only when, as an educator, I have a strong sense of why things work, why things don't, and from that, knowing what to put up and what to put down, therein lies my ability to treat the stuff of teaching and learning in a flexible manner. If you begin instead with practice, it is much more likely that you're going to obey a kind of recipe for success, rather than beginning with the principle and saying, now I know this about retrieval practice, or now I know this about cognitive load. How can I use that as a lens through which to see my practice and make the right kinds of decisions more of the time? And this very much is in keeping with what, again, we often talk about as evidence-informed practice. This is from the work of Kat Scott out of the UK, and she talks about three really powerful but intersecting priorities that any leader within an educational setting ought to be able to consider. The first is this notion of the best available research. We need to be able to draw on the fact that we are learning more and more about learning every day. And if we don't rely on that, then we are leaving an enormous amount of value off the table that would otherwise be able to allow teachers to navigate the very difficult choices that they make in classrooms. But that's not enough. These principles need to be applicable and usable within the localized context within which they are being employed. It would be one thing to have a really rich understanding of a particular principle of the mind, but if you can't make it work where you are at in your school with your learners, then what is it for? And finally, if we do either of these things, but we leave out or we ignore the experience and expertise and indeed professional judgment of our teachers, then again, we should not expect to be able to see meaningful change. These ideas are not here to replace what teachers already know and are able to do. They're not here to replace their experience or replace the expertise that they have already established over time, but rather they're a way to further refine and nuance and again, lens, if you will, the way that they are thinking about learning. It's giving them another means by which to see their practice and hold up a mirror to their practice and think about how they might improve. And in a lot of the contexts within which I've worked, particularly the ones I named at the beginning of this talk, I see the effect of that on teachers. And what you notice is that teachers begin to have a self-perception around feeling more of a professional. It's as though we get teachers and we have teachers begin to say to themselves, just like medicine or engineering or law, there are things upon which this profession is built. And when I can connect to those foundational concepts, that allows me to make more professionally sound and informed judgments. So I'm going to talk you through a couple of things now. I'm going to start by norming our terms in terms of what do we mean when we talk about learning science. And then I'm going to go through three specific learning science principles and explore what they might look like for leaders in particular. So let's start with a sacrificial definition of learning science. This is, as I'm named here, a definition. It is not the definition, but in order for us to be able to ensure that we're talking about the same thing when we talk about learning science, I'm just going to norm our terms at this stage. So when I think about learning science, I think of it as a set of principles that represent our best understanding about how people learn. As I said moments ago, these are our best understandings. That is to suggest that the field is constantly evolving, and as professionals, we ought to be able to and be supported to evolve with it. We know more, for instance, about how to operate and replace a hip if you're an orthopedic surgeon today than you did perhaps even 3 or 5 years ago. And what does that mean? That means that those professionals have to go back to learn how to engage and operate according to that new technology. And teaching should be no different than that. So we're always thinking about the best available evidence and thinking about how do you get that into the hands of those who need it. The second is that these principles are themselves backed by evidence from the field of cognitive science and educational psychology and instructional design. And they're shown to have positive effects on student learning. There are many really fascinating studies out there that describe certain aspects of the mind, but unless they have been shown to move the needle for learners, then frankly, they're not of use to us within this particular case. And then, of course, these principles and the evidence upon which they are based are applicable. They have to be. We often refer to this as teacher actions. That is to say, if a teacher can't hold these ideas and use them within an instructional context, then once again, they are perhaps not fit for our purpose, or at least for our ambitions for our learners. And then, of course, underpinning all of this is what we often refer to as equity-driven evidence-informed practice. That is to say that if we are going to improve school systems with learning science in mind, it simply cannot be that the beneficiaries of that are the same students that have always been served by schooling, as opposed to those who have traditionally been marginalized and underserved and left out of the conversation of what it means to succeed. And so all of this is driven towards the notion of how do we ensure that all learners are thinking, all learners get to think deeply, all learners get to move along that continuum of expertise that I was referencing a moment ago. So here's how I'm going to move through this from this point on. I'm going to deal with 3 different principles in particular: cognitive load, effortful thinking, and prior knowledge. And as you'll see at the bottom, in each case, I'm going to offer you both a micro and a macro lens. In other words, to begin with, explain how this principle might play out within specifically instructional settings, the micro within a given classroom, but then to zoom out to the macro and say, how are these ideas similarly supportive to our leaders? What's good for a student, what's good for a teacher, and what's good for a leader ought to have some degree of alignment. And if we can provide that lens so that whenever we're thinking about teaching, learning, or leading, we are operating from similar standpoints when it comes to what we know about how the mind works. So I'm going to talk you through each of these briefly, and then we hopefully will have a chance for some questions and discussion. So let's start with this idea of cognitive load at the micro level. Now, one of the ways to think about cognitive load is simply to say that the degree of load that we put upon learners at any given point in time is the demands of the task over the available resources for that task. Now, in this instance, available resources could, of course, be anchor charts or vocabulary lists or any other means of scaffolding that you as the teacher can provide. But I would also wager that the available resources are also the cognitive resources of those learners. And as we know, the working memory of learners, of all of us, is incredibly limited, around 4 to 7 knowledge items that can be held in a learner's mind at any one time. And so if the amount of cognitive resource, at least in terms of the how capacious our working memory is so finite, then the manner in which we use that information or that window of thinking, that window for learning, is really, really important. And we cannot unwittingly exceed the cognitive load of our learners. There's a really simple way to illustrate this, which is essentially a kind of thought experiment, which is to say, if you asked people to put the days of the week in alphabetical order, the vast majority of them would be able to do so. If, by contrast, you invited 1,000 people to put the months of the year into alphabetical order, it is highly unlikely that most of them will be able to complete that task. Why? Because there are only 7 days of the week, but there are 12 months of the year. And in the second condition, you would have maxed out your working memory because you would have had to have juggled those 12 items in order to put them in alphabetical order. So what does this tell us about what cognitive load might look like at the macro level? If we know that we have to manage the cognitive load of our learners, what does that say about our colleagues, the adults in the building, as it were, and those with whom we work and try to improve every day? Well, one lesson for leaders is essentially to say that workload and cognitive load are not, in fact, the same thing. I've worked in environments where the workload has been incredibly high, but because the cognitive load was low, you felt as if you could take on more and more and more and more, and the extent to which that was weighing you down cognitively was minimal. Similarly, I've worked in environments where the workload was at least low at a kind of quantitative level, but the qualitative nature of the thinking that was required was incredibly high. Such that became an impediment to me feeling as though I was being successful in engaging with that work. So as leaders, we need to be absolutely certain that we are managing the cognitive load of the people with whom we work so that they can get on with shouldering the load of their work that they know that they can do incredibly well and that their expertise is suited to. And when you have that, you're able to achieve and arrive at a degree of alignment whereby everyone knows where we're headed, we have a sense of directionality, and everyone knows what part they play in showing up into that environment. And if we overwhelm our colleagues by overloading their cognitive load and not considering that they too have a degree to which they will not be able to exceed a certain degree of thinking and complexity, then if we ignore that, we do so at our peril. And so when we think about the application of cognitive science principles, we think about it at the level of gradual, strategic introduction of new concepts, focus on incremental shifts in practice. There is such a thing, metaphorically speaking at least, as a system that has been cognitively overloaded. We need to be able to be thoughtful and incremental in the manner in which we make change so that our schools and systems can cope with and tolerate the rate of that change. Otherwise, don't be surprised if that change does not become apparent. So that's cognitive load at the micro and the macro level. Let's look at our second principle for the day, effortful thinking, and first so at the micro level. So one of the ways that I tend to think about effortful thinking is through a metaphor of digging. So imagine if you were trying to dig for water, the question would become, would you dig one shallow hole? Would you dig many shallow holes? Or would you dig one deep hole? And I'm sure we can all agree that digging one deep hole would be the right way to go. Why? Because, and this is very much how thinking works, in order to dig a hole that deep, you need to stay at the site of that digging site for longer. That is the same with thinking. We need to invite learners to stay at the site of thinking long enough to dig deep enough into a concept. That often looks like saying to your learners, slow down, look closer, and see more. Because if we dig shallow holes, you're never going to get to the depth of meaningful processing that would make those ideas stick. The problem, of course, and I'm sure many of you have recognized versions of this as well, is that when you walk into certain classrooms, sometimes you will see many shallow holes being dug. In this sense, it often comes about as a result of curricular materials and the demands of curricular materials in terms of the rate at which certain concepts are required to be covered within a curriculum. So you end up with somebody inheriting a 70 slide deck for a particular class. And the assumption is, because there is compliance, that you're obliged to have to follow every single one of those 70 slides exactly as they have been presented to you. Once again, this is that example of brittle knowledge. What would instead happen if you had flexible knowledge would be to say, I can take that curriculum. I have the means and the eyes with which to see how to make the most of it. I can, for instance, say that this, and this is in large part redundant for my purposes. So therefore, I get to invite learners to stay at the site of thinking longer, because we get to dwell on these ideas long enough to do them justice. And so you might be able to look at the difference between two questions like this. In what year did Zora Neale Hurston write Their Eyes Were Watching God, versus why were the themes in Their Eyes Were Watching God controversial given the time in which it was written? The second option requires the learner to stay at that site for longer, and it requires more of a cognitive lift. It requires them to think more deeply about the thing that they are currently paying attention to. Notice how it is not the same as overloading them cognitively. The cognitive load, in terms of the number of items that they're being invited to think about, is low, but it doesn't skimp on the rigor or complexity with which that thinking needs to occur. And the more meaningfully we think about something, the stickier that concept becomes. But this isn't the only way to think about thinking, at least within the effortful realm. There's also this idea of not just digging deeper, but also digging smarter. This is a much more forensic, nuanced, thoughtful way of digging. And it often looks a little bit more like an archaeological dig. The notion that when we dig as an archaeologist, we need to be able to identify what we're finding and then to be able to define the characteristics of that thing. So let's say, for instance, that you found an ancient spoon on an archaeological dig and you put it into a bag that was going to be taken back to the museum that would file it away in their archives. You wouldn't simply just write the word spoon on that bag. You would be more likely to write something like a bronze spoon with a floral design from this era meant for this purpose. And it turns out that thinking and learning are really similar. The more sides that we attach to an idea, the stickier that idea becomes. In other words, when we think about schema as an interconnected network of ideas, you need to think about things in the way that they relate to other things. And the only way to do that is to acknowledge that ideas don't operate as singularities. They operate as having multiple dimensions, multiple sides, multiple facets. So in order to get our learners to think in ways that rely on and lead to more durable knowledge, again, we shouldn't skimp on revealing and inviting exploration of the many sides of an idea. And so an example of this might be something like this. Again, two options. How is a spider not an insect versus how many legs does a spider have? Now, in option 2, the only way to answer that question is with a singular response. You may get it wrong. You could say it has 12 legs, but it's still a singularity of response. In the first option, in order to understand and express how a spider is not an insect, you need to think about all the things that makes a spider, all the things that makes an insect, and the manner in which they are either similar or different. In this first option condition, the sides to the idea of a spider and the sides to the idea of an insect suddenly become more multi-dimensional. We move simply from the language of spoon towards the language of the bronze spoon with the floral design from this era meant for this purpose. And of course, it is not just enough to be able to dig deeper or dig smarter. You also need to be able to dig in the right place. This is to say, we ought to be able to map directly onto stated learning objectives upon the standards upon which those objectives are built, and to be able to answer a really, really important question. Not what is the content for this lesson, but rather what should students be thinking about in order to be successful in this lesson. And those are two subtle but very significantly different things. So let's turn our attention to the macro level of effortful thinking. If that's what effortful thinking looks like within a given classroom with a given set of students, what happens when we zoom out? What does the notions of ethical thinking tell us about how change might happen at the larger level? Well, again, I will draw on this same metaphor. And as leaders, we may have to ask ourselves, are we digging too many shallow holes? This is almost like what we might call the initiative carousel that I was naming at the beginning. The more times that you introduce a new initiative, you're essentially expecting those within the system, your teachers, your leaders, your school leaders, and so on, to move from shallow hole to shallow hole to shallow hole. And oftentimes this happens when there is leadership change or churn. The new leader comes in. It is their intent and their hope that they can impose themselves and announce themselves to their new community. And more often than not, that comes in the form of an impulse towards new ideas, new initiative, new ways of doing things. Also, it becomes important to consider not just the ideas and initiatives that are being promoted, but to consider, can they actually be connected to a coherent understanding of the change that is happening as a whole? If you're going to push forward an initiative, is it just something that hangs in space where there's no means by which to say, okay, I understand how this aspect of change can be acknowledged in keeping with this other aspect of our priorities? Or is it something that just stands alone with no point of reference to understand why that aspect of change is being promoted? And then finally, of course, to this notion of being able to map this onto a shared vision of change, does everyone get it? Does everyone understand the collective aims of a system? And is everyone involved in meeting them? I once read recently a very interesting article about a cancer center over here in the United States that works tirelessly to support and try to provide care for children with different forms of cancer. And part of the way that they organized themselves around this work was that if you asked anyone in that building, anyone in that hospital, why they were there, they would say, we're here to cure child cancer. That didn't matter if it was the person who was the custodian cleaning, if it was somebody working in the cafeteria or serving coffees, or if it was somebody who was a surgeon who is the person engaging in operations. Everyone had their mental model of what that institution, this hospital, was there to do. And everyone felt empowered and implicated to contribute to that effort. And no one's left out, both in terms of your commitment, but also your accountability to commit to a common aim. Okay, now the last of the principles I'm going to explore today, and this is this notion of prior knowledge. Now, at the micro level of what goes on with particular learners in particular classrooms, there's a way of thinking about the difference between novice and expert schema. I already touched on this a few times before today, but this idea that novices don't think the same way as experts. It's not just that they know less. It's actually that they organize information differently. Novices think of information more like a shopping list, a series of singularities like spoon or insect or spider. By contrast, the more expert you become, the more you think of information like a family tree. You acknowledge that any item of information exists through its relativity to other ideas. And these networks of interconnected ideas is what we call schema. And that idea of growing expertise, as I mentioned, can be expressed as that schema becoming more sophisticated. And this gets really interesting, of course, because there quickly becomes apparent that therefore there is a gap between what an expert thinks it is to be an expert and what a novice thinks it is to be a novice. There's a meme that we used for one of our recent books on this that sort of gets at this point: how to draw an owl. Figure 1, draw 2 circles. Figure 2, draw the rest of the damn owl. The idea here being that if you can only draw the owl on the left, the 2 circles, then it must feel like flying to the moon to be able to draw the expert owl on the right. Conversely, however, if you can expertly draw the owl on the right, then you've probably long forgotten what it would feel like or mean to only be able to draw the two circles on the left. And so we find this really interesting challenge, which is that if we know that new knowledge requires a place within prior knowledge to fit in order for it to stick, but that experts don't recognize that this is how novices need to be able to grow towards building greater sophisticated schema, then we begin to see a gap between the educator's conception of knowledge building and the reality of the lived experience of students, cognitively speaking, when they are trying to learn. And even when learners are able to add more and more pieces to their emerging puzzle of an idea, that doesn't even guarantee necessarily that they're going to assimilate that new information in an accurate and relevant and coherent way. Even as we watch learners build a puzzle of knowledge, there's nothing to suggest that it couldn't end up looking like this. And so as educators, we need to be crystal clear about understanding what is the current schema that my learners hold, and what would it look like for them to build and expand and make more sophisticated that schema without it leading to a kind of corrupted vision of knowledge like the one represented on the screen. So that's what it might look like at that micro level, but what might that teach us as leaders about how it operates at the macro level? Well, one thing to be acknowledging of here is the difference between experience and expertise. If we think about our colleagues, and whenever they show up to work every day, they are bringing at least those two things: their experience, the thing that they've accumulated over the years of their time in the classroom, and their expertise, the degree to which they are able to continue to hone their craft. Now, the important point here is this: experience and expertise aren't the same thing. Experience, for the most part, can come about simply as a result of the passing of time. And as a result, there's very little that we can do to regulate experience. It is simply what we gather along the way. Expertise, of course, is something over which we have greater control. We have the ability and the means by which to improve and hone people's expertise. But again, we often merge these two notions together, and we think to ourselves, well, if somebody is highly experienced, it must follow that they are necessarily experts. And by contrast, just because someone is inexperienced, this might mean that they have a low degree of expertise. I've worked with teachers who are in their second year who have already acquired a greater degree of expertise than another teacher that's been teaching for 20 years. And so we must, even as leaders, acknowledge what are our teachers, our colleagues bringing into educational environments. And when we explore the ways in which we can support the professional learning of those people, how can we use an understanding of their schema and of schema in general to build competency over time? And then, of course, there's this idea that systems, again, themselves have a history. They have prior knowledge. They have the core values, assumptions, and foundational principles upon which to act. And yet, very often, institutions, organizations, systems forget about that foundation. And part of what ends up happening is that you get stuck in what we might call single loop thinking. You act, those actions generate results, you observe the results, and then you act in accordance with what you observed, and so on, and so on, and so on. Rather than single loop learning, I offer to you what would it look like to engage in double loop learning. That is to say, you act, you receive and generate results, but then you loop back to the assumptions, the values, the why of the work, the reason that you set that course of action in the first place, to be able to say, is this still where we want to be? Is this still heading in the direction of where we want to be? Or are our change efforts sort of shaking on the track? And are we in danger of veering off of our course? In a sense, this is like tapping into the institutional prior knowledge of any setting within which this kind of work happens. It's almost like the adage of saying, if we forget the past, we're destined to repeat it. What would it look like to be able to delve back into that institutional knowledge, that institutional memory, and indeed our institutional priorities, and keep ourselves honest in service of the change that we hope to bring about? So I'm going to close out with a few high-level takeaways. And then if we have the time and any of you are interested in asking follow-up questions, I'd be delighted to have that conversation. So to try to sum up what it would mean to develop more flexible knowledge that can be more effectively applied at the level of leadership, we might start saying that we must build strong shared mental models of what good teaching and learning looks like. This idea that we need to be able to present theories in accessible and relevant ways, that it's really important to cultivate a consistent language. When I talk about retrieval and you talk about retrieval, we both know that we're talking about more or less the same thing. And then, of course, it allows for this idea of adaptability. Again, moving away from compliance and simply following instructions, but to acknowledge, because I'm building a robust mental model of what good instruction looks like based on an understanding of learning, I can begin to be more thoughtful and interpretive in the way that I engage with the instruction that I'm tasked with leading. Then there's this notion that in so doing, you get to honor the professional expertise of those around you. This recognition that experience and expertise are not the same thing. This notion that it's not enough just to ground our decisions in evidence, but also in the professional judgment of the teachers with whom we work. And that when we do that, as I mentioned earlier, the teacher's self-perception of themselves as teachers, as professionals, often begins to grow. Another thing that flexibility does in the ways that I've described is that it allows us to move more intentionally towards coherence. This idea that if we have a collective focus and we make the means of arriving at that focus super explicit, then you can get this notion of what we might call a cascading model, which is to say, if I am the governor of a region or a superintendent of a district, or I'm a executive, or I am a principal, or I am an assistant principal, or I am a classroom teacher, all of those people that make the system work ought to be able, if you ask them, what does teaching and learning look like around here, to have some degree of a coherent, aligned understanding of how they would answer that question. The best systems with whom I've worked and that I've encountered have that degree of both vertical and horizontal coherence and alignment. And we feel that when we have the common language and common practices and almost the common kind of learning science literacy within a system, that drives up the likelihood of that coherence actually occurring. And then finally, this idea that when we employ all of this, whether or not you are a teacher or a leader, you are in a sense valuing the depth and the rigor of with which the learning, the teaching, the change, the system is operating, rather than simply falling into the trap of speed being the ultimate criteria for success. This means that we can start with principles first, rather than jumping to strategies. It means that we can afford to be incremental in our shifts so that we don't make 100 changes and dig 100 shallow holes before realizing that we have made no kind of meaningful change in any one of those arenas. And this in turn allows us to avoid what we sometimes refer to as the boiling the ocean outcomes. We're going to take on everything, and what ends up happening is that you don't end up effectively taking on anything. And so when I think about this idea of the carousel, as the metaphor with which I started, when we get to employ learning science principles as a lens through which we make better decisions, it invites us to get off that carousel and instead to be able to acknowledge a simple, coherent, strategic path that would allow us to move towards more meaningful instructional improvement. So I'm going to stop sharing now. I think this will allow me to go back to the normal settings. Hailey, there you are.
Hi, Jim.
We have about 10 minutes remaining. Are there any questions coming down the wire?
There are, yes. And what I thought I'd say as well is that I really enjoyed that, Jim. So thank you. And for myself, who's leading PD at scale in a multi-academy trust in England, I've lots resonated, to be honest. And you know, we've taken an approach this year where we've aimed to build a shared mental model. So we've gone for that principles first because we didn't want to fall into that trap of that kind of technique soup that you were kind of alluding to there. And I just wanted to pop as well on the screen the link to a course that Jim and Carl have made at Academica, How Teaching and Learning Happens. And essentially, this is like your why for any school strategies. This is that shared mental model that Jim was talking about. So I just thought I'd pop that on the screen there for people to see. So we have got some questions. So I can share some of those with you now. So the first question, and this came in via email because there's been a bit of a problem with putting the questions onto YouTube this evening, okay. I think, is this one. So how can school leaders tell whether an initiative is genuinely evidence-informed or just intuitively appealing?
That's a very good question. In many ways, this is where I kind of distinguish between sort of the science of learning and the applied science of learning, right? Like this notion of, yes, we can, quote, think like researchers. I'm not convinced that every school leader or teacher ought to have to be a researcher and think like one. The question becomes, how do you rely on authoritative, well-backed, well-resourced, well-researched ways of thinking about evidence? This is really hard. Like, I'm not saying for a moment this is straightforward. A lot of curricular materials will make the claim that they are evidence-based. And oftentimes it really is no more than just whacking a sticker on the front of the curriculum and saying so. So my sense would be that in a sense, what we've been talking about up to this point, which is this notion that when you develop a more nuanced mental model of what good teaching and learning looks like, it allows you almost to sort of filter out the stuff that, as you know better, you can do better and start to see, actually, now I know more. I know that there's an aspect of this that actually doesn't work. And now I know why. Or even more powerfully, now I know more about this practice. It's not that I need to rip it up and start again, but rather with a few small tweaks and adjustments, I can tighten my focus on how to apply these principles. And really, as you will well know, Hailey, this is where instructional coaching and the power of the coach-coachee relationship begins to come into play. Because if you're my coach and I'm your coachee, and we're talking about how I ought to improve, but we don't have a common understanding of what improvement even looks like, because we don't really have a strong sense of what good looks like within instructional settings, how are we even supposed to move towards a better place? So I think it comes from that growing of that shared understanding, and then that lens allows us to sort the genuinely evidence informed from things that simply appear to be appealing on the surface. And one more thing I'll say is that, if I can find it, I wrote a book about this called Instructional Illusions, which is exactly the notion that oftentimes the thing that seems as though it would be intuitively effective is often the very opposite of the thing that we know works. And often these things sort of flatter to deceive. They present themselves as being effective because they appear to make intuitive sense. But once you dig beneath the surface, you're able to start to see some of these practices for what they really are.
Yeah, absolutely, and very similar to Lethal Mutations as well, which you know that
Absolutely.
I'm currently writing a book on, and you very kindly agreed to write a part of as well.
Yeah.
Brilliant, thanks, Jim. Next question, and this is a really good one. How can leaders stay close to teaching and learning without returning to the classroom?
Wow.
I often joke about this because I haven't taught a lesson for 5 years now,
Yeah.
and I'm advising teachers on how best to teach their lessons. So
Yep.
it's a
Yep.
slippery slope.
Yeah, absolutely. It's there's almost a level of kind of built-in, dare I say it, kind of like hypocrisy that can sometimes be communicated in that, because a teacher could be sitting there saying, well, hang on a second, you haven't darkened the door of a classroom in 20 years, so why should I be sitting here listening to you? I do think that there are things that are difficult for us to expect leaders to do because of the number of priorities, competing priorities that they already have. But my push would be to shift those priorities and expectations, which is to say, again, the best systems that I've worked with, and if I push into a system and I'm going to do a series of professional learning kind of opportunities over the course of, say, a year or 2 years, when leaders commit to that kind of time horizon, they're essentially saying, this ain't going anywhere. We're not just doing the year of the brain. We are committing to a course of action over time where we are all going to grow our understanding of these ideas. And the best way for a leader to compel people to say he actually means what he says or she actually means what she says is to be one of those people that commits to that growing understanding, that they themselves position themselves as learners in that regard as well. So I've worked in districts where you show up and the superintendent kind of breezes in and says, what's this thing today? What are we doing? And I've been in other environments where the superintendent is there, front row, pen and paper out, wide-eyed, ready to act like a learner, just like everyone else. And so I think that this is as much about the messaging, the significance, the symbolism that is communicated when you as a leader say, I will never expect something of you that I'm not prepared to engage in myself. And chief amongst those is that we need to continually grow our understanding of what it means to lead and teach within educational environments. So like if you're a leader and you don't do that, how could you possibly expect and anticipate that those that you are leading will do the same? So I think there's a compulsion there. I would say we should hold leaders accountable to be more educative in the way that they think about what they do.
Yeah, and it's about having that vulnerability and that humbleness as well as a leader, I think, actually, to, a lot of my decisions that I have when I'm coaching senior leaders and teachers in schools are asking them about their decisions. I basically want them to share their mental model with me. So I'm not going in there making a judgment. I want them to talk me through the decisions that they've made to make sure that they're doing the right thing at the right time for the right reasons. So they're the experts in the classroom, not me.
Right.
Thanks, Jim. Last question that we've got time for, I think. What should leaders look for when judging whether a curriculum or initiative is truly evidence informed? Really practical one to end.
Yeah. So there's a lot of there's a big movement here in the US in relation to what's called high quality instructional materials, our HQIMs. And once again, there is this question of whether or not just because it says it's high quality, does it actually mean that it is? And so what we need to be able to be is essentially kind of critical consumers of the curriculum that we inherit. And I will say inherit, because oftentimes the person that's tasked with employing it has very little say in what they are being asked to employ. But what begins to happen once you, again, I'm not trying to sound circular here, but once you build that mental model of what good teaching and learning looks like, again, it gives you that other lens. So again, a specific example. Let's say that you were, as a teacher or as a team or as a school, had an emphasis on this question of effortful thinking. What is the nature of student thinking that needs to occur in order for them to successfully encode knowledge in a robust way? Well, if that was a departmental focus or a focus between a coach and a coachee, I could imagine taking a curriculum or a lesson plan and going through it. And what I ask folks to do when I ask them to do this is to internalize it, which is to say, actually do the tasks. Actually be the one who walks a mile in the shoes of the learner, do a task, and then literally say to yourself, what was the thinking I needed to do in order to do it? And at that point, you get the closest you can to a kind of X-ray into the black box of the student's mind that they would be, what kind of cognition would be taking place when they engage in that task. Look at what we're doing at this moment. We're bringing the best available evidence. We're connecting that with the contexts within which the work is happening. And as the professional who has a strong understanding of the content and the concepts at play, you get to live it. And through all of those three aspects of intersecting understanding, you get to say, actually, don't think that fits the bill. It got me to think about this and this, but I was never expected to think about this next layer. Or I was invited to think shallowly, but not to the full depth of the standard. And unless you have a lens through which to make those informed choices, and unless you engage in a process where you are able to test out those questions you might ask of curricular materials, again, don't be surprised if the first time you walk in and is that you're just going to have it on a clipboard and follow it like you're following a recipe. Don't be surprised if that lesson is likely going to go awry.
It's all sense making, isn't it, Jim? Essentially,
right. Yeah,
and it's having the time
and the cost of not doing so, right? Like you and I well know, in all parts of the world, the amount of money that has been spent on initiatives and big splashy kind of events and ways of thinking about improvement that we would know, or anyone who works in this field would know, you might as well have taken the money out in the street and just burned it. Because if you understand these principles, you are able to make evidence-informed decisions on behalf of your community. And the allocation of those resources, be it time, be it money or human resources, that really, at its most basic, is all we have as leaders, is our ability to shape those things and the means with which we communicate and hopefully captivate people to engage in those priorities. But if you don't have the lens, then how do you even know whether or not what you're establishing is the right course of action? So the lens is the thing, the application is the thing, but the understanding of the principles must come first, and then strategy grows out of that understanding.
Amazing. Thanks, Jim. And if people want to read more of your work, where can they find it?
Yeah, if you go to learningsciencepartners.com and you'll see a way to get in touch with me, and you'll also see a bunch of additional resources there as people want to learn more. And if they do want to learn more, I'm always open to talking and continuing the conversation.
And Jim's written some great books as well. He mentioned Instructional Illusions. His latest book was Mental Models, which I absolutely loved reading as well. So if you haven't checked those out and you want to hear more from Jim about this subject, do check them out. Okay, thanks, Jim. Thanks, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your evening.
Take care.